Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group, and I am really honored to bring to our listeners Ettie Zilber. And Ettie is a fabulous Holocaust educator, spending most of her life now doing this. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Ettie so that you can get up to speed. Ettie wrote a terrific memoir called Holocaust Memoirs of Love and Resilience, Mama's Survival from Lithuania to America. Dr. Zilber was born in a displaced persons camp in 1949 in Germany after World War II. In 1950, Ettie and her family immigrated to the United States. She grew up and was educated in New York City and in Pennsylvania, and then emigrated to Israel after completing graduate work. After retiring from a career in education, with Ettie being eventually the director of several international schools in 6 different countries, she currently resides in Arizona with her husband. She's a board member for the Phoenix Holocaust Association and devotes much of her time in giving presentations to youth and adults worldwide. And she just mentioned to me that she's on her way at the end of the month to go to Lithuania to speak. So I want to tell you a little bit about the book, The Holocaust Memoir of Love and Resilience, Mama's Survival from Lithuania to America. With the Nazis' occupation of Kovno, Lithuania, Zaita Sentoki Sidre, and if I didn't pronounce that, maybe you can help me here right now and say
Zlata,
that.
Zlata, which is a common Eastern European name. Santotsky was her maiden name, and Sidra was her married name.
Okay, and her life changed forever. She was Jewish, but she survived the horrors of the Holocaust. Gone was her normal life and her teenage dream of becoming a doctor. Instead, she witnessed untold massacres, imprisonment, hunger, and slave labor before transporting to Stutthof Concentration Camp. Her story of the death march is a testament to her fighting spirit and the limits of human endurance. Yet the challenges did not end with liberation. Lovingly compiled from recorded interviews and researched by her eldest daughter, which is Ettie, this is an account of a remarkable, resilient woman who raised herself out of the ashes of unimaginable hardship and sorrow. She found love and happiness where none could be expected, a secret marriage in the ghetto, escapes, dangerous border crossings, reunifications, and life-saving friendships. Ettie's quest to learn more about her ancestry led her to Lithuania and Poland in her mother's footsteps. The author reflects on the impact of her family's experiences on her own beliefs and behaviors, thereby adding to the literature about second generation and transgenerational trauma, which is terrific. And I'm so happy that you are going to bring that forward here today. In these memoirs, she honors her family by telling their amazing story of survival and collects evidence to corroborate their painful history. So welcome. And I don't want to give away the book. That's just a little teaser. But we're going to start by first going all the way back and talking about your parents, where they were living, their time when their families were pre-war, the customs, the Jewishness. So why don't we start there?
Okay. Well, interestingly, both of my parents were from the same city. They didn't necessarily know each other when they were very, very young. They actually met and fell in love in the ghetto. But they were both from the city of what the Jews called Kovno, Lithuania. Today it's called, the Lithuanians call it Kaunas. The Germans called it Kauen. And they were both from the same city. Both were good middle-class families. My mother's father was a butcher, had his own little butcher shop. My father's father was an electrician and had his own factory and metal foundry. So they lived very, very comfortably. They were not particularly religious. They were more progressive or liberal, if you would say that. But they followed all the traditions and the customs, and they were very, very interesting people. And so they were in Kaunas, when the Russians came in 1940, and then of course in 1941 when the Nazis came in. What was their life like? My father never really liked school, as I understand it, but he was a brilliant man. And as an educator, I get that. And my mother's family, my mother was an excellent student, and she went to the Lithuanian schools. She went through Lithuanian schools, and she was already in a Lithuanian gymnasium, which is very rare for a Jewish person to be able to be accepted in a Lithuanian gymnasium. There were Jewish schools. My father went to Jewish schools, and most of the Jews did. But my mother decided that she would have better chance of getting into medical school if she went to a Lithuanian high school. And so that's a little bit about their background.
So you have, obviously we want to talk a little bit about the camp experience, and maybe you can talk about the leading up. Obviously it's now you said 1940, I believe. And it sounds like your mother is primarily where the book is focused on, and your father has as much of a role, obviously, but not necessarily in the book. So I want to do sort of a matching. I want to give your father as much time in this interview as your mother, because obviously it's a pairing, right? And they had both together come through the Holocaust, and I didn't know that they came from the same town. So maybe you can tell a little bit about a brief bit about each of their kind of camp experience.
Well, before the camps, they were in a ghetto for 3 years. Kosovo ghetto was one of the longest standing ghettos in Eastern Europe. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I won't go into it. But before the Nazis were the Soviets. They had the Soviets for 1 year, and life was difficult. It was different. Many Jews as well as Lithuanians were sent off to the Gulag for a variety of reasons. But in the Jewish mind, the Soviets were better than the Nazis because they knew very, very well what the Nazis were doing. So they figured, oh, we'll have to live with the Soviets.
So how were the conditions during the Soviet ghetto? We all know what the conditions are in the ghetto and the Nazis, but I'd be very interested to learn.
There was no ghetto under the Soviets.
Okay.
What happened was the Soviets came in and nationalized most businesses. As it turned out, for my father's family, they had a big factory, and they were living upstairs in the factory. So clearly the Soviets took over the factory and kicked them out of their home.
What was the factory?
It was a metal foundry.
Okay.
And so they had to go and find a place to live. And since my grandfather had invested every penny into the foundry, there wasn't a lot extra. So they were having a difficult time economically as a result of that, but they were not persecuted. So the Jews were not pinpointed for persecution under the Soviets. They were pinpointed for other reasons, as were the Lithuanians. Now, as you know, the Nazis broke their treaty with the Soviet Union and attacked the Eastern Europe and attacked the Soviet Union. And of course, they came into Lithuania. So in 1941, there were massacres on the streets by the Lithuanian auxiliary forces. And hundreds of Jews were murdered, brutally murdered, ransacked, and robbed. And shortly thereafter, the Nazis came in, established themselves, and they announced that they were starting, all the Jews had to move into the ghetto. So my parents lived in the ghetto for 3 years.
From when to when?
From 1941 to 1944, almost exactly 3 years.
All
And-
under the, all, and the conditions of the ghetto were similar to the conditions of other ghettos?
Oh, yeah, terrible,
Okay,
terrible conditions. 30,000 people living in an area that was maybe good for 6 or 7,000. So that immediately tells you what it was like. But then they started what was called the actions.
yeah,
And they had a whole bunch of actions every time, and they started sending people off to be murdered. The big action, 10,000 people, almost 10,000 people were sent off to be murdered. And so
so,
this
so
continued
can,
throughout the 3 years.
so can you help me and educate me? So Babi Yar is in Lithuania,
No,
correct?
no,
No?
Babi Yar is
In
Ukraine.
Ukraine, okay, and so how close is Ukraine to Lithuania?
Ukraine is further down south from
Okay,
Lithuania. It's
okay,
not even bordering on Lithuania.
okay,
Lithuania is bordered with Belarus now and Poland, the Baltic Sea and Russia,
okay,
and Latvia on the north.
okay. So what, is there a specific, like we have Babi Yar in Ukraine, was there a name for the Lithuania killing zone or?
Yes, there were multiple killing zones, but the biggest one in the Kovno area was the Ninth Fort. And the biggest one in the Vilnius area, which Vilnius originally belonged to Poland, and now it belongs to Lithuania. I believe that if more than 50,000 were killed in Ponar, in outside of Vilnius. And there were many other killing sites in Lithuania, which have almost all of them been identified.
Okay, so they're now in the ghetto, and obviously they take us a little bit further in their path of the Shoah.
Well, in the ghetto, life was quite bitter, and the most important thing was to get work. Clearly unpaid work, right? This was all forced labor. But depending on how lucky you were or your connections, you would get a job. And so with that job, maybe you would get some extra food as a result.
So
So
what job did your father have, and what job did your mother have?
originally, my mother was part of the thousands that were sent out to the airport to fix the airport for the Nazis. Later on, she was transferred to other workshops. They set up these workshops to do all sorts of, make nice clothing for the Nazis, boots. My grandfather worked in, my mother's father, he was almost murdered, but that's a long story. I'll tell you about that. And it all because of this medal. He wasn't murdered the first time around, but he was sent to the Gestapo prison, and he managed to get a job in the Gestapo kitchen. I have no words for the luck of that event. Because of his job in the Gestapo kitchen, he always was able to bring food home, which was not always available for most people. My father's father was an electrician in the ghetto, as was my father. My father worked with him in the workshops. So they were also very, it was a good job, what they called a good job. And that was the most important thing in the ghetto, that you have a good job, as opposed to being sent out to labor camps for physical hardship labor under all conditions.
Okay, so we're now getting closer to 43. Then, and then,
Yeah, well, over 3 years. Meanwhile, my parents met.
okay,
And, regardless of conditions, it seems that love has no obstacles.
that's
And they
nice.
met and they fell in love. And of course, it was forbidden to get married in the ghetto. And they decided they're going to do it anyway. It's forbidden to get pregnant or have a child in the ghetto. All of this penalties, pain of death, So they did get married in the ghetto, but that was already sort of toward the end of the ghetto. They got married in June 44, and the ghetto was destroyed in July, the beginning of July 44.
When you used the term destroyed, was it liquidated
Yep.
or what? And so, or bombed, or what?
Totally bombed and burned down.
So
And
how did they survive that?
well, each one in a different way. My father escaped from the ghetto at the end, and that's a story in and of itself. And then my mother, as many other Jews, they built hiding places. They didn't realize that the ghetto would be burned down. Of course, the whole ghetto was made of wood. And so many Jews built hiding places, figuring they could hear the Soviets around the corner. They figured if they could wait it out, the Soviets would come and they would be saved. Unfortunately, the Nazis knew that many of the Jews are hiding in bunkers, malinas as they were called, and they torched it, they bombed it. There is nothing left of that portion of the ghetto.
So you mentioned your mother and your father are now married. Your father escapes with your mother, or your mother gets a different path out?
She hid in a malina, and when the smoke started to fill the malina, they said, well, we're going to die this way or we're going to die that way. So they got out, and then they were they were taken to the trains, and from the trains they were taken to concentration camps.
Okay.
And that was in July 1944.
So your mother went in the concentration camp, and which one is it?
She was sent, all the women from Kovno were sent to Stutthof, which is on the Baltic Sea next to the city of Gdansk.
And the Germans are occupying there and running that camp. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay.
And the men were all sent to Dachau, but actually a sub-camp of Dachau in Germany called, named Kaufering. And so the men were doing their forced labor in Kaufering. The women were doing forced labor in and around Stutthof in those satellite labor camps.
Now, you said your father escaped from the ghetto, but he was caught and then sent to Dachau?
No.
No, so he didn't stay out of the concentration?
He went into hiding, and the Soviets came a few weeks later.
Ah.
So he was liberated August 1st. Oh, today.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Today he was liberated by the Soviets. He was in Kaunas, so he was free, basically. Free, you know. He was
so where did he go after being free? Did he go to
he stayed in Kaunas. He stayed in Kaunas, and
he created another occupation for himself there, or how did he feed him?
Everybody had to go and get a job. So everybody went and got a job. You had to eat, you had to have a place to live. So the sad story about my father is he died very young, and we weren't savvy enough at that time to sit him down and get the full testimony, as we did later on with my mother when we actually interviewed her, recorded it. I have all the recordings, and that's the basis of my book.
Gotcha.
Her verbatim testimony. But we were not that able at the time to think about interviewing.
So your father passed away when?
In 89.
89. And how old was he?
He was 60, what was he, 66?
Oh, very young, actually.
Very young, cancer.
So, okay, so we're going to kind of skip over obviously your mother has a very difficult time in the concentration camp, obviously. But, you know, I want to move to because we don't really talk about the displacement camps very much, as, you know, the concentration camps get a lot of everyone interest. But let's talk about the displacement camp. And were you born there? Okay, so let's talk about what you know of the displacement camp. And before you do that, I'm really interested because my parents both were survivors, mom from Auschwitz, my father escaped from Nazi Berlin at 15, but they never spoke to us at all, not one peep about their lives during the Shoah. So I'm really always interested as to whether your parents spoke to you and when they spoke to you, or was there, and you talk about trauma, we'll get to that at a much deeper level, but you indicate about trauma, and I'm always interested because neither my parents ever showed any outward signs of any kind of trauma. there was no crying at night. There was no, I know that my mother had stomach issues her whole life and complained about back problems, but they never were traced back by my mother to a camp experience. So I'm curious, when your parents, both your mother and your father, were they volunteering information to you? Were you curious? When did you start asking about that information? And then we'll go back to the DP camp question.
Okay. First of all, as a child who was born in a DP camp, you know immediately from day one that you are different. And of course, that the most common thing is for a child to ask questions. Oh, why were we there, and so on. But I have to backtrack a little, because we are a family that is very, very fortunate in many ways with regard, and I'm very familiar with many Holocaust stories. We have photographs, and most survivors have nothing, zero. So for us, it's a blessing. And there are a lot of reasons why we have so many photographs. But this photograph of my family was always hanging on the wall in every one of my houses. So
when was that taken? When was that taken?
This was taken probably in 1940, either during the Soviet occupation or just before.
Mother's side or father's side?
My mother. This is my mother here. Where's my finger? That's my mother and her family. Now, this photo was given to my mother after the war by a neighbor, because my grandmother, whose name was Etta, and I am named for her, okay? So she had the foresight to give some photos to a neighbor, and that neighbor gave us back those photos. So why am I telling you this? Because here I have the photo on the wall. I'm born in a DP camp. My mother tells me that this is your grandmother and you're named after her, and that's your grandfather, and these are my sisters. And where are they? Well, they were killed in the war, So it's an immediate connection. And so we always knew, we didn't know details.
So how many siblings do you have?
I have two younger sisters, and one is 5 years younger and the other is 13 years younger. So we like to laugh, and we laugh a lot in our family, which is one of our blessings. My little sister says, I had different parents. You had different parents than I did. Completely different, because she was raised totally differently, almost as an American kid. I was raised as the refugee kid, the first one after the coming to America, the first one born in Europe, coming to America. So of course, the refugees, they're European, they raise you like a European kid, plus all the trauma that they had.
Okay, we're gonna hold on a second. We've just come to the end of our first episode. That's how fast it goes. And we're going to be coming back and having much more of a discussion with Ettie over the series of interviews that we have scheduled. So you're listening to the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Geisner for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance. We're interviewing Ettie Zilber, who has an amazing story, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of Ettie's story. So come on back, and we'll see you soon.